Another application here is the financial markets. We can also use the demand and supply framework to analyze the financial markets. So you can see the demand and supply framework actually is a very powerful tool in our economic analysis. So in the financial markets, the key price here is the interest rates, that the interest rate will adjust demand and supply for money, so that will obtain an equilibrium. So an interest rate is the proportion of an outstanding loan that borrowers must pay to the lenders each year. So suppose you borrow $100 at 5% interest rate for 1 year, you have to pay back $105. Right, that's the meaning of interest rate. This table shows some types of debts or loan and their corresponding interest rates in this year. So we can see for mortgage, the average interest rate is around 6%. For credit cards, average interest rate is around 24%. For student loan, it's around 8.5%. For business loan, that's around 8%. Payday loan, that's around almost 400%. So we can consider the financial market as the supply and demand for money. So the spenders or borrowers, they are demand money, right? And the savers or lenders, they are supply money. So you can think of the interest rate as the price of the loan, right? So for the supply curve, we have upward sloping, because if the interest rate get higher, there will be more people willing to lending money out. So that there will be higher supply. So we have an upward sloping supply curve, right? So for the demand curve, it's downward sloping, because as the interest rate goes up, there will be less people willing to borrow, right? So we have downward sloping demand curve, and we put the supply and demand together, we can find the equilibrium price, which is the equilibrium interest rate, and equilibrium quantity, which is the total amount of debt in the equilibrium. Right. So now you can see this example of the US federal debt. The federal government, they are borrowing or demanding money when issuing debts. Right? So it's equivalent by borrowing money and issuing debts or issuing bonds, supplying bonds. These two things are equivalent, because when you selling bonds out, you are borrow money in, right? So for the federal government, when it's selling or issuing bonds, they are actually borrowing or demanding money. So in our framework, they are the demand side. Right. So we can see that after the crisis in 2008, the federal government, they demanded additional funds for a bailout following the crisis. As a result, we can see there's a surge in the quantity of federal debts after the crisis, right? So how to analyze this fact in our framework? So the question is that if we see an increase in the money demand, right? How will the price, which is interest rate, change? With this framework, the federal government, they are demanding money, so they are the demand side. Now the crisis comes, they want to raise more funds for bailout, so there will be an expansion in demand. The demand will increase, so the demand curve will shift to the right. Right, so we go from this equilibrium up until here. So we should see an increase in price or increase in interest rate. That's our theory or model, right? But is that true actually? The answer is no. actually we see a decrease in the price or interest rate. So this figure shows you the interest rate by the US Treasury securities at the same time period. So we can see after the crisis, the actual interest rate are actually going down. So what's happening here is our theory wrong? Or if we still believe our theory, how should we rationalize that we saw a decrease in price and increase in demand at the same time? You can pause the video and think a little bit about it. The answer is that there must be a large increase in the supply at the same time to drive the price down, right? So we are in the initial equilibrium here. If there is no change in supply side, only changes in demand side, we must see an increase in price because new equilibrium should be here, right? But if we experience an increase in supply side at the same time, which means we have a supply curve shift to the right, we will have a new equilibrium here. And if the change in supply is large enough, we actually can see a decrease in price, right? So that's our rationalization of these facts. So now the problem is that where are this increase in supply from? So remember here, the supply side, which is the supply money, is equivalent to demand for federal bonds. So because when they supply money, they are buying bonds in, so they are demanding federal bonds. So the increase in supply side is equivalent to increase in the demand for federal bonds, right? So what's happening is that the first force we should consider is that at the same time after the crisis begins, the Federal Reserve, they introduced the quantitative easing and purchased a large amount of federal bonds. So if you see the right figures here, the gray line represents the US Treasury security holdings by Fed. So if you see the gray line, there will be a very large increase after the crisis. So there will be a large increase in the demand for federal bonds or large increase in the supply of money by the Federal Reserve. Right. A second force that will increase our supply is that if we can see the holdings by foreign countries, actually after the crisis, the US Treasury security holdings by foreign countries also increased a lot, especially for China, for Japan, for Europe, right? So what's happening here is that the demand for these safe assets, still remember the demand for the federal bonds is equivalent to the supply in money, right? So during this time, the demand for safe assets like federal bonds will increase a lot as the financial instability increases, right? Because people will regard the federal bonds as safe assets because that will pay a very stable payback and the credits of the US government is really good. So people regard that as safe assets. So after the crisis, other countries will have increase in the demand for such assets. So that's equivalent to our supply in money. Right. So now we go back to this figure. We can see that after the crisis, we see both one, we see an increase in the money demand by the federal government, right? So that will shift our demand curve to the right. And at the same time, we will see a large demand in bond or large supply in money by either the Federal Reserve or other foreign countries, right? So that increase is large enough to drive the price going down. That's why we see an increase, a decrease in the interest rate after the crisis.